We are continuing our discussion of the narrative and storytelling, and given where we are on the calendar, we're going to talk about presidential stories, and I can't wait. We're going to talk about all the president's money. Megan Gorman is here. Megan is the founder and managing partner of Checkers Financial Management, a female-owned high-net-worth tax and financial planning firm in San Francisco. She's visiting us after having visited the Carter Library last evening. This is just an amazing book. Megan has done a lot of thinking about the relationship that we all have to money and our own stories, so I couldn't wait to talk about this book. I'm also, like her, a little bit obsessed with the presidents and history. So welcome, Megan. I'm so pleased you're here.
Oh my gosh, Larry, I'm thrilled to be here as well. So it's fun to talk about the presidents, so I can talk all day about them.
Why, for folks who aren't odd like we are, why a book about the presidents? And I love how you made those connections, but why a book about the presidents? And why a book about the president's money?
So, like a lot of people, I love reading about the presidents. Since I was 5 years old, I was that little kid who'd go into the library and grab a book on Lincoln or Kennedy or Washington. But I spent my whole career, 23 years, working with wealthy people. I started 12 years at a division of Goldman Sachs and have my own practice. And I've had this sort of front row seat on how do people behave, how do they build wealth in this country? And my clients in particular, publicly traded CEOs, CFOs, they have a lot of skills and traits that I found interesting when I was watching them. And then I would read books about the presidents and I'd be like, Richard Nixon bought a house or George Washington did this. And it started to make me realize that they had stories too, like my clients. And money is so humanizing. Right? I mean, Larry, I'm sure everybody in this room, we all wake up at 2 a.m. worried about money. And the funny thing is, when I was doing research on this, I found a lot of primary source documents. And in the book, I mentioned Lyndon Johnson. I found a letter of his from 1941 where he says, I waked up worrying about money at 2 a.m. And it's just wild how common that feeling is. So that's how it was the genesis of the book.
Yeah, you return to themes around financial insecurity, financial resilience in the book. And you also use the book to have all of us reading it think about our decision making about money. Most people, I think, look at what the presidents have done, how they've made money, and they lean on the familiar stories. Hard luck and grit. That's how I made my money. And you tell the story here, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are so many decisions that come into having financial resiliency. And so people always talk about wealth, but the true thing you're searching for is financial resiliency, the ability to weather life's ups and downs through your income and your assets. So what was interesting in looking at the presidents, and this is true of all of us today, is any of us could read a book on how to manage your money. But what's going on with you psychologically, your life experiences, also drives your behavior. And so when I was looking at that, and I'll take one of these traits for instance, one of the most fascinating things I found out about presidents is a lot of the ones who are financially successful married up. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower. You look at these men and you found out they married women who were wealthier than them. And it wasn't that they weren't doing other things to build wealth, but that marriage would pull them up. Now, I will tell you, in Lincoln's case, it got a little precarious because Mary Todd Lincoln had some issues. And so they have what we would call today a little bit of financial infidelity going on, meaning she was spending and not telling him, and he was saving and not telling her. And so they were a little mismatched there.
And you break the book. I want to get to some of the presidential stories, which are really fun, but I want to contextualize them as you do. You talk about building blocks. You talk about understanding meaning in your life and in your relationships. And then you talk about wealth builders. So let's spend some time with the presidents in each of those categories. So for building blocks, I think we can agree, we're not going to give too much away, I think we can agree that we would never want Thomas Jefferson in charge of our budget.
Oh God, Thomas Jefferson, do not take any financial advice from. And by the way, when you go to Monticello, he has like these tenets of how to live your life. And he does say, don't spend what you haven't earned. And it's like, oh honey, you are not living your life that way.
Right.
And this is one of the things that, if any of you here work with a financial planner or tax person, you're often asked, hey, where do you see yourself in 10, 20, 30 years, right? And it's not that we're being nosy. We're asking that question because we're trying to have a little bit of science kick in. We want you to connect with your future self and see your future self as a friend. And if you see your future self as a friend, you're more likely to make financial decisions for that person's benefit. And in Thomas Jefferson's case, it was not a time period of a lot of longevity, although he lived well into his 80s. And he was not good at thinking ahead and thinking through decisions financially. So for instance, he had really phenomenal taste. I mean, he lived in France.
Great parties.
Oh my, fabulous parties. You could be invited to any of president's parties. You either want Kennedy or Jefferson. But the thing about Jefferson was he wasn't really present in managing his budget. And part of it was he owned plantations and he owned slaves, so he was very illiquid. And he wasn't willing to make sacrifices like potentially selling land to create liquidity to support his lifestyle. And so as we talk about in the book, what ends up happening to Jefferson is quite tragic. The end of his life, he's in so much debt, about $2 million in today's money, that he has to put Monticello up for auction. Now, could you imagine a president today doing that? I mean, I don't think we're going to ask Bill Clinton or George W. Bush to put their house up for auction, but Jefferson, it was in the paper and you could buy tickets. And luckily in Jefferson's case, a bunch of Americans got together and said, look, Tom, not a good look for you. Let's, maybe do a GoFundMe and we'll help give you some money. And so they took it off the auction block. But he still died with the equivalent in today's dollars of about $2 million in debt. So really, really a tough story for someone who was so brilliant and an amazing thinker and writer. And just as a side note, I would give up all my financial acumen to have one day to think and write like Thomas Jefferson, because he was a very amazing philosopher.
So for building blocks, that building block is really think about what you're spending, some of the basics. Mm-hmm. You also talk about education and Abe Lincoln.
Yep.
This is a man who really, really read everything. So talk about the building blocks of building wealth and relationships. It's not all about hard luck and grit. I love how you frame this out and say, here are some great examples of folks who are tending to those building blocks.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We're talking about this today. We're in Massachusetts, home of Harvard, right? There is a path in the United States where if you go to certain schools or get access to certain educational opportunities, it opens a whole door, right? Taking today's candidates, if we looked at J.D. Vance, we all know his story of growing up poor, but once he got into Yale Law, his opportunity set changed because he got that badge of an Ivy League education where he got to make connections. And so what's interesting in U.S. history and about building wealth is there were people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln who couldn't go to college. Washington's father didn't provide for it in the will, and Lincoln, we know he grew up poor. So Lincoln went through a schooling of what we would call self-education. He read a lot. And one of the things he did is he got active in business right away. And when he leaves his father's house at age 21, and 21 was an important age in America at that time because until you were 21, everything you made, your father had a right to. And they didn't get along. So when he turned 21, he was out of there. And he goes to a place called New Salem, and he meets a guy named William Berry, and they decide they're going to have a store. Now, Lincoln doesn't have the money, so he borrows the money to start a store. And neither of them are great business people. They make every wrong decision in the book, right? We could have done a whole symposium on all their bad business decisions. And as the business is failing and about to shut down, William Berry does the most convenient thing out there, and he dies. So Lincoln has his debt, and he assumes William Berry's debt. And this is in 1835, and it's about $1,000, which doesn't sound like much to us today, but it's about $37,000 in today's dollars. So you think about people going to college today, incurring student loan debt. Lincoln, even though he was self-educated, he had debt coming out really early. And he was a funny guy. He always called it his national debt. And he worked hard to pay it down. And the difference with a Lincoln today than with kids coming out of college today is it was a lot easier to pivot and make money then, whereas today coming out, it's a lot harder. And he does get the ability to pay this debt off and continue to self-educate himself.
So I want to move from some of the building blocks to some of meaning, the meaning of wealth. Gerald Ford. So congressman from a congressman, accidental vice president, accidental president in some ways. He really figured out the meaning of wealth when he got out. Talk a little bit about that in the book.
Yeah,
It's not all positive.
And by the way, the book is very non-political. So Jerry Ford is an interesting character in American history. And, over the course of his whole life, whenever he had a decision point, he was never afraid to go in a contrary direction. So really quickly, he goes to college. He's at University of Michigan, plays football. And he has one game where he's amazing. And the scouts are there. And he gets 2 letters, one from the Detroit Lions, one from the Green Bay Packers. They want him to go play football. And Ford looks at this and says, no thanks to both letters. I want to go to law school. So what does he do? He goes to Yale and becomes the coach of their football team and eventually makes it into law school. So he's a different thinker. And where Ford is interesting is when he got into the White House, he was still living paycheck to paycheck. He literally called someone when he got in there and said, when do I get paid? I have to pay my mortgage. And you don't think of the presidents worried about money like this. But Ford, by the time he got to the end of his presidency, he was like, look, I'm young. I'm 62. And he was frustrated. Any of the presidents will tell you it takes 2 years to become good at that job. And he had just served 2 years. And then he was leaving office. So he sort of looked around and he's like, look, I can't play golf all the time, although he does play a lot of golf, as we know. And so what he did was a little different. He went and he hired a talent agent from William Morris, a gentleman named William Brokaw, who in the 70s had worked with all the big Hollywood stars. And they came up with a strategic plan post-presidency. He was going to write books, which he did, and he and Betty got the first joint book deal. He was going to do speaking engagements, and then there was quote-unquote entrepreneurial endeavors. And so Ford, does the speaking, does the books, and he does do this entrepreneurial endeavors. And the first endeavor that he does, which we talk about in the book, is he decides to partner with the Franklin Mint. And the Franklin Mint to us today, no offense, is very kitschy.
Cheesy.
It's very cheesy, right? But in the 70s, people, especially going through the bicentennial, people thought all these medals and statues were going to really increase in value, okay? Not a good investment. But he decides he's going to put out these presidential medals, and he does. And he gets such blowback. The press comes after him and really says, who does Jerry Ford think he is? He's like an accidental president. If it wasn't for Nixon messing up, he would have just faded into the sunset. Nobody would have ever cared about Jerry Ford. And so Ford pivots from this. And what Ford does, which I think is really interesting, is he goes on corporate boards. Now, we're sort of used to this today, but Sandy Wheel of Smith Barney talks about this. They do oral histories at the libraries. And Sandy Wheel says, look, bringing him on the board was fascinating because we had all business people on the board. And this is the guy who was in charge of the free world. He sees the world and the opportunity set
different way.
Completely different.
Right.
And I love that idea, especially when you think about companies and bringing on different thinkers and different way of looking at it. It's a very Jerry Ford way of embracing the world. And Ford, by the way, left the White House worth $200,000, dies in 2006 worth between $7 and $8 million. And, I think he did a very good job of transforming what it means to make money in the post-presidential life.
I want to continue with meaning, and you don't shy away from the complications of wealth as they relate to slavery.
No.
So let's talk a bit about Polk and Washington, because they are sort of contrasting figures as it relates to owning people.
Yeah, so we have 12 presidents who were slaveholders, right? And it's morally reprehensible. But what what was really interesting in looking at their money is a lot of them were able to build their wealth, maintain their wealth by owning slaves. A large number of those 12 presidents struggled with slavery, and Washington's one of them. And I would tell you, if it wasn't for the slavery question, Washington was the president we should all aspire to be like with money. And Washington struggles with this idea of slavery to the point where, as he's writing his estate plan, he has 2 versions of his estate plan. One freeing his slaves and one not. And you have to remember, some of his slaves were his and some of his slaves were his wife Martha's from her first marriage, from her dowry. And Washington gets sick, he is dying, and he asks Martha to bring both of the wills to him. He throws one into the fire, and the other one is the will that they use. And when he dies and they read the will, what they find out is he says, upon Martha's death, the slaves can be freed, which sounds lovely, right? Okay, finally, he's come to his senses. He's freeing his slaves. But if you actually think about the legal intent of that language, it means they need, like, Martha's life is now at risk. And there's a letter that Abigail Adams writes a friend, because Abigail Adams hears that Martha is really distressed and there had been a fire at Mount Vernon. And by the way, I get why there was a fire. I'd be gunning for her too if I was in that situation. And Abigail Adams talks about the fact that Martha's struggling with this because she loves her slave family, but she knows she has to write the writ of manumission, and she does, to free the slaves because she is a fear for her life. So Washington's story has a lot of the complexity of slaveholders where they feel a connection with their slaves, which is a very murky, complicated world. James Polk is just sort of pure evil about his slaves.
Complete phony.
Complete phony. We've got the North and the South. They don't get along. Polk is sort of trying to placate both the North and the South. He's a Southerner. And while he's doing this, and he gets in the White House, he is hiring agents to slave trade. So, what they would do, and this is horrific, is they would buy young slaves, and they were more profitable. So he would buy a family, and then he would sell the children elsewhere. And at the same time, James Polk was signing a lot of the legislation that brought Texas into the Union. So when Texas came into the Union, all of a sudden the value of slaves went up. So these are people profiting off of the legislation. And you read these letters that he's writing to the agent, and he's like, listen, you can buy this slave, but just don't tell them it's for me. And that's the part of presidential money that's like, ugh. But you know what? God has a good sense of humor, because Polk leaves office, goes home, and within a year dies of dysentery, and he never burns his papers. And so that's how we know he was slave trading. So I've always sort of think it's a just ending for Mr. Polk.
I want to talk about wealth builders. You talk about building blocks, building meaning. Now, this is really about people who create a legacy. You just came back from the Carter Foundation. Talk a bit about Jimmy Carter, how his relationship with money and how that impacted people's thinking about him.
It's funny, I get asked the question a lot, who's the wealthiest? And if I ask people, do you think Jimmy Carter's wealthy? I think most Americans would be like, maybe? Like, I don't know, probably. Okay, Jimmy Carter, awesome with money, okay? Unbelievable. But like Ford, not afraid of the pivot. So Jimmy Carter grows up, father's very successful in farming in Georgia, but Jimmy Carter grows up, goes to the Naval Academy, becomes a nuclear engineer, and actually has to get approved by Congress in this job. And he and Rosalind and their 3 children are living in Schenectady, New York, making $300 a month in 1952. They're living so comfortably, they're saving $75 every month. I mean,
life is good.
Life is good. It's the post-World War II dream. And he gets word that his father's dying, and he goes down to Georgia, and his dad's on his deathbed. And people are coming up to Carter while he's in town saying, if it wasn't for your father, I wouldn't have survived financially. And he comes to find out his dad's making loans to people. His dad's supporting widows who lost their husbands. He's sort of the guy in town who's just the guy in the community everybody can turn to. So Carter has this epiphany, goes back to New York and says to Rosalind, I'm done here. We're going back to Georgia. And Rosalind looks at him as like, over my dead body, we're getting divorced. I mean, and you think of Rosalind Carter, she's so demure, right? But no, she's like, this is a mistake. Well, he brings her back to Georgia, kicking and screaming. They live in like housing, like an apartment complex. She's miserable. And Carter struggles a lot with turning this farm around that he's inherited from his father, because it's 1952 and 53. And like today, when you have like a pandemic or the Korean War ending, huge inflation, problems with weather. But after about 3 or 4 years, things start to turn around for Carter. He's very consistent in his behavior, always learning, always trying to take risks, builds this huge farming enterprise. But what's really important to Carter is that anyone could turn to him if they needed to, and he would have helped them. And so what you see over the course of Carter's life, and obviously his post-presidential life, we're all really aware of Habitat for Humanity and the work of the Carter Center, is it's not about acquiring wealth and holding on to it. It's about taking money and wealth and changing the world. And there's a number of presidents who really were like this. Herbert Hoover, who always gets a bad rap in the press. The presidency was the worst 4 years of his life.
Right.
Herbert Hoover grew up poor, becomes one of our wealthiest presidents, saves the world twice. He feeds Europe twice after World War I and World War II, all because he's a good budgeter. And you've got other presidents like FDR who changes charity. So when people ask me, and I know this wasn't your question, but people ask me all the time, who was the wealthiest? It's a really hard question to answer because it's really about what money means to them and what they're really trying to achieve. And Carter's a great example.
I want to go to that. A lot of our folks in the audience, CEOs, board members, they love history. What do you want them to take from this? I mean, it's a great, rich, engaging book. Why did you write it? What do you want them to get out of this?
So first of all, the presidents are just like us. I wanted to humanize them in a way because I think of them as my friends. I've always been reading about them, and I regardless of their political party, once they get into history, they're fascinating. But they're also a reflection of American life and the American personal finance landscape.
Right.
And what I learned in studying them is it's always been hard in this country from a personal finance standpoint. But it's gotten harder. And what I mean by that is Richard Nixon went to college in 1930. It cost him $230 a year. That's about $8,000 today. Today, Harvard, $80,000, $90,000. Buying a house, when Calvin Coolidge was debating buying a house, and by the way, he didn't because he was afraid to, he was looking at a $5,000 house, right? It's just the housing market's gone out of control. So what I want people to take away is that they're not crazy. This affordability crisis that's going on is really impacting the middle class and the American dream. And we should really be focusing. It's hard to change institutions. I can't change the banking system, but we can change how we navigate our personal finances around those systems.
I love the power of storytelling throughout this book because you do offer a variety of lessons for each of us through the story of a particular president's life or a particular endeavor or investment. Megan, what are you reading? What are you thinking about? What kind of author or innovator in your complicated world where you're in the intimacy business, you're talking with families about what to do with their money. What are you reading? What are you thinking about? What are you recommending to people?
I mean, I would tell you when you work in the money business, it's 80% psychology. I read a lot of nonfiction and history. So I'm actually, and finally now I can start to read for pleasure again, because when you're writing history, you're reading constantly. So the two books that are on my nightstand right now is one by Richard Norton Smith, who's the leading historian on Jerry Ford. He just came out with a book last year. And then a woman named Heath Lee, a historian who wrote a book about Pat Nixon. And I guess I think I'm reading them. I read these books because I'm curious of how people are thinking. Because when I'm working with clients,
right.
Even though they might know that this is the technically right financial answer, I'm trying to understand why they feel the way they do. And I think understanding how big leaders like Ford or even Pat Nixon, who supported a very challenging husband at times, how are they thinking and how do they process it?
Oh, terrific. The book is All the President's Money. Megan Gorman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and set up outside so that you can all get this amazing book. I want to thank everyone for joining us at this Authors and Innovators, both the folks online via live stream, all of you, our sponsors, our amazing innovators. We have plenty of time. Please go back, get some lunch, spend some time with our innovators. They really want to meet you and engage with you. And if you have thoughts, recommendations, or book ideas for next time, you can reach us at authorsinnovators.org. We'll be doing interviews throughout the year and perhaps even a podcast, so stay tuned. Thank you all for coming.